This evening we have a very interesting topic, but before we get started, I want to kind of single out some people who are the unsung heroes of this course. But before we do that, we've been besieged with this question. Where are these lectures that we've seen in the past here? You know, maybe we're here and we saw a wonderful Lieutenant Colonel Janowski. In fact, somebody wanted to run him for president, and I'm sure that his campaign manager might be in the crowd. And we had, of course, Dr. von Kallenbach, Dr. Stayhill, James Campbell. You go through those, you say, I would love to review those again. I might have missed something that night. There were so many people, etc. Well, they're there. They're on YouTube, youtube.com. Now, if you don't know technology, find about a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, say the word YouTube, and they can teach you. So if you're a grandparent and you don't know the technology, they'll help you with it. Just say YouTube. Every kid knows it. And you want to type in Muskegon Community College World War II class or History 297, and they will pop up. Now we're all the way up through Lieutenant Colonel Janowski's lecture. And we will be putting more up in the next week or two. So please go out there, review those. Show those to your friends who tell you that they're too busy to come. Maybe after they see one or two of those, they will become less busy, right? And they'll feel like they should be here. We have all of this year's as well as last year's online. Now, the unsung heroes. There's been a guy who you haven't heard one word from the whole time because he's the most busiest person here. That's Rod Van Nortwick, our director of the TV services here at the college. He's been filming every one of these. Would we give him a round of applause? He's been an unsung hero. Now, there's also been two ladies. I couldn't put their pictures up because pictures would not do them justice. There is no camera that can capture their essence. They are the best supporters and the most wonderful people to this course. One is Dr. Marilee Scallows. Marilee, would you stand up so they can experience you in the true life? And Mary Scott. Mary, would you please also stand up? Mary, let me tell you something. You talk about a trooper. She had some severe damage on her house, even lost electricity, and she's still here tonight. Now, that's called the world's greatest generation. Thank you. Now, over the last few weeks, you've kind of got an essence of how widespread and devastating World War II was. How big a world engagement this was. Not only Europe, the Pacific, and the magnitude of death, destruction, atrocities, etc. Just unbelievable. Clearly defining in history probably one of the most devastating conflicts that man has ever wrought upon himself. And what we want to talk a little bit tonight about is the concept of total war. What is total war? Well, if you read through history, wars in the past usually were engagements between two armies. Maybe they fought out on some barren plain, and the winner was able to inflict damage on the loser. Maybe it included such things as taking over their country, enslaving their people, and war was definitely very important. Don't get me wrong, because nobody wanted to lose, because that would be an altering thing. But one of the things that was a differentiator was that people that were non-combatants were not often the subject. Not often the subject of military actions. And there was a respect, in some cases, for women, children, maybe the elderly or the infirm in previous engagements. But all of that began to change, and change very greatly, starting in the late 1800s, and rapidly took a turn for the worst with World War II. And we're going to talk about this change, how civilians now will become a subject as a target. They will be a prime element to be attacked, so you can demoralize your enemy, make them feel like they are less able to resist. And much of this is going to come with the concept and the technology of airplanes, tanks, and other vehicles. The technology changes the warfare. And the strategies that will morph from that technology, the concept of blitzkrieg, which will become very much the vogue in the late 30s, early 40s, as the lightning strike, coordinating armor and airplanes to terrorize and demoralize one's enemy. And we will begin to see the targeting, intentional targeting of civilians. And where this begins to start taking a larger-than-life perspective, it was already previewed during the Spanish Civil War. The use of the German Stuka plane, which had a siren when they went into a dive. And before they released the bomb, you hear this high-pitched squeal, which would play on the psychology of those people on the ground. In other words, screaming before you, like, ha! And you give a person a punch and they hear ha, and they know what's going to happen next, right? That auditory signal is going to mean there's some devastation. Where we begin to see this change drastically is in London during the Battle of Britain. And it's a product of lack of technology that might spawn this, because the Germans did not have an invasion fleet that could bridge that channel to be able to attack England. So during the early stages, it became an air war. At first targeting the air bases, naval bases of the British, and then it became the targets became urban centers. London, Manchester, Leeds, to the point where those people were attacked in an effort to try to force them to surrender or to give up. And we will begin to see that with the change that will result with the London bombings, when you hit somebody, oftentimes people don't what? They don't back down, do they? They retaliate. And the British will retaliate for the aggressions of the Germans. And you can say, well, one justified the other, but I would say nothing justifies that reaction towards civilians. And you might say, well, you weren't there. You shouldn't be able to say that. But in hindsight, it's like the Monday morning quarterback. Why was that play run? It was inappropriate. Probably we will see that this was part of the inappropriateness of the war. The targeting of innocent civilians. Was it a strategy that was feasible? And when the Germans attacked, we saw that it dispirited and it caused terror among the civilians, to the point where in London they took out little children, separated them from their families, and sent them to the countryside to get them out of harm's way. They took out the infirm and the elderly in many cases to get them out of the fire, because there was no way to protect fully against aerial attacks. The airplane has now become the new wild card. How do you defend against somebody that bombs you from 8 to 10,000, 15,000 feet? And he may do it in the dead of night when you're least expecting him or to do it. And in the early stages of this war, this battle, 250 sorties, which is, it's not going to be very many, but it's now the start of a bigger thing. Well, here's some of the victims. Those are toddlers, 3, 4 years old, maybe at the most. These children have to be removed. Otherwise, what happens? They get killed. But what if you don't have the ability to move these people somewhere else? As we're going to see later in the war, maybe you're living in a country that's constantly being attacked. Where do the people go? Can they avoid conflict? And that'll be part of the structure. Well, this is HE 171, I believe it is, Henkel. It's attacking. Well, it's changed also in terms of the realization by the Germans that the lightning strikes the blitzkrieg. And I know when we listened to Dr. Stahel, he really did a nice job of tying that up, that the Germans suddenly felt vulnerable, that ability to strike a quick victory with the troops that they had faded away. And it was fading away from the minute they moved. And he talked about Operation Barbarossa being an undermanned, under-logistic campaign without enough supplies. And by the time it was starting to reach its objectives, it was running out of gas. And the Germans realized that this wasn't going to be 5 or 6 week attack on France with a capitulation. This was the Soviet Union, and they would punch back. So now we begin to look at engaging industry and civilians. And you know the horrors. We talked rather extensively about the Eastern Front and the losses associated with that front. There was just tremendous losses. And this is going to result in a transformation that had to occur in Germany. Germany has to come to the table. It also has to use techniques that are being used against us. Now remember that the RAF is bombing them. Starting in 1941-42, they're taking the war to Germany. And Germany also reciprocates by taking the war to the Soviets. Now, what we begin to see is some very concepts of bombing, or aerial bombing. And there's 3 types of bombing that are defined for this period. Strategic bombing, which usually are direct attacks on strategic targets located in urban areas. Knock out the factories, knock out the centers of production, centers of supply, the utilities, etc. And if the civilians happen to be there, so be it. You can't do much about that. Remember, these are not precision weapons. They're not the airplanes or the drones of today where you can put the drone on the nickel because it has GPS. We also have tactical bombing, which is done with airplanes supporting ground units, armor, etc., which will be coming into play, that the airplane is an extension of a greater campaign. And then we're going to have what we will call terror bombing. Maybe the targets are not logistically important, but maybe they're a morale buster. If we can bomb someplace and drag the enemy down, so be it. Well, here are 2 of the weapons that were employed by the Allies. One is the Lancaster, which is a British heavy bomber. Now remember that the British and the US will develop heavy bombers that can transcend the distance from England to drop their payloads in Germany and be able to return without refueling. The only problem is that those planes, the B-17 and the Liberator, cannot be supported by the fighters of the time, the quick planes that would ward off any sort of interception by the enemy. So therefore, what do? You compensate with making a heavy plane. You put a very large crew, because at least half of the crew has to support defending the plane. So you have tail gunners, you have nose gunners, turret gunners, all of them being the eyes and ears to protect against attack, because they're moving slow and they're delivering quite a punch. In 1942, a conscious effort was made by the British to change the strategy. Having been attacked themselves, now attacking Britain, do we continue this effort? Because airplanes are costly, as we all realize. Planes, even in World War II, were costly products. They were not cheap to make. So what do we need to do? Do we put our money in airplanes? Do we put them in Navy ships? Do we put them in the armies? Well, the British decided, based on Professor Lindemann, Frederick Lindemann, in a strategic paper that he wrote, directed to Churchill in the cabinet, he says, put your money in planes, because guess what? That's the only way that you can harass the enemy. We can't right now, we don't have the logistics to land an army to take the Germans on. This is the only way we can support a Western front. And we need to do this in a very concerted effort with three objectives. First, bomb cities, dispirit the civilians, disrupt their population, just like you may have been disrupted this past weekend. You didn't have maybe electricity, or maybe a tree hit your house and your roof has got a hole in it. How uncomfortable is that? That's minor. Now let's take your house and blow it up. Where do you live? Where do you get your food? Where do you get your utilities? Where do you stay? And how can you continue to go about your daily life? And that third objective, again, to disrupt the industrial production. Because despite it all, Germany is continuing to produce, and it will continue to produce each subsequent year in the war, up to 1945, record levels, more than the year before. And if you ever read Inside the Third Reich, Albert Speer's book, he outlines how they took their production, hid a lot of it in mountainsides and other places, and used slave labor to increase their production of strategic military components. Well, that intentional bombing is going to be accompanied by the development of new weapons. We're going to see two different type of munitions, aerial munitions, that will come out. One is called the blockbuster, a munition that's going to destroy concrete, blow off the roofs out of houses and large industrial complexes. And the second is the development of incendiary bombs. These will be fire bombs. Drop the firebomb after you blow the house up, and what happens? You burn whatever else is there, creating firestorms that will be so great that when we talk in a second about Hamburg, that these firestorms will have temperatures of 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. They will not be able to be quelled by fire departments. Here is an interesting diagram, and it's interesting in two ways, because this is part of the Allied approach, because later on England and the United States will couple together, and this was their thoughts. If we drop the bombs, we'll destroy homes, we'll disrupt their utilities, we'll force cities to create evacuations, we'll create wounded and killed people, and this is what it will do to the people. It'll erode their ability in believing that they can win the war. They're going to start having doubts about their Nazi leadership. They're going to have concerns about the confidence in Hitler and his cronies, and it will cause issues with group unity. And these are the things that the Nazis might have done to cause this to, or at least try to fight it, using propaganda, air raid protections, relief and evacuation, and in the last instance, when order breaks down, use the police or the military to enforce discipline on the civilian populations affected. Whether this strategy worked is questionable in some regards, because as we will begin to see, as the war unfolded, cities were utterly decimated. But yet the Germans continued to do what? Fight. One of the classic examples is Operation Gomorrah. It's interesting how we name operations. From the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah. What's that all about? Two evil cities, what happened to them? Destroyed, and the earth that they were on was salted, as I recollect, right? So nothing ever could be put there again. Well, this is going to be the targeting in July, late July of 43, the industrial port city of Hamburg. 7 days of intense bombardment. But what is notable is the fourth day, actually the third to the fourth day, the evening of the third to the fourth, July 27th, when 42 or 43,000 people perished because of firestorms, these incendiary bombs going off, quite literally destroying Hamburg, decimating the place. The same approach is used in other places, Dresden and other places. And you'll hear tonight about Mainz, who is our two guests have connections to. 80% of a historical city with minimal industrial capacity being wiped out. A cultural and historical place, no regard, just bomb it. It's the enemy. Decimate them. But I have this video. If somebody wants to watch this at the end of class, you're more than welcome to. It's a visual record of the bombing of Hamburg. This is what you will see, among other things. Who can live there? Does that disrupt your life? Does it alter your production? Does it take away your desire to fight? I don't know, but it sure doesn't look good to me. Do we want civilians to pay the price for military? All questions. I don't know if I have the answers, but some of you may want to reflect on those. Our speakers tonight, we have two wonderful ladies. Miss Louisa Calkins, who is here, a native of this period, right, Louisa?
Yes, I come from Mainz.
Mainz. She knows the place well, and she can tell you her experiences with this bombing. Now, you've been in the United States 52 years, is that correct?
50 years.
50 years.
But right. I'm married 52.
52 years, married. So one of these war stories, you know, you can find a beautiful husband and they can take you away from the problem, bring you to the wonderful United States. And of course, we're reintroducing our department chair, Miss Kathy Tosa, who was here last year as part of the lecture series, but she's got some new things to contribute this year, and we'll be collaborating with Louisa. So
we have a video about done by WZZM. You maybe recall that some bombers came to visit here in the Muskegon area, and this was the video that then was created.
Several lucky Lakeshore residents are making a once-in-a-lifetime flight this week. For $450, they are flying over Muskegon in a World War II B-17.
But for one Muskegon woman, the sight and sound of the plane passing over her home is bringing back a wave of emotion. And WZZM 13's John Mills explains.
It is one of only 8 World War II B-17 bombers still flying.
It wasn't uncommon to have 200 planes go out on a mission and lose 40 or 50.
And it arrived in Muskegon Monday, attracting attention and offering paying customers the chance to fly in the plane that helped defeat Nazi forces in Germany. But every time this old bird passes over Muskegon Lake,
When you heard this huge noise, huge hum, the earth was shaking.
Louisa Calkins remembers vividly the day in 1945 B-17 bombers destroyed her hometown.
People screaming, body parts here and there and everywhere.
As a young girl in the town of Minsk, Germany, Calkins already knew the horrors of war. Her father was arrested.
Because he had spoken against Hitler, and they arrested him.
2 uncles were killed in Auschwitz, and Nazi troops took over her grandfather's business. Then Allied troops started dropping bombs.
You can't describe that nightmare. And I didn't realize how upset I was about this whole thing until I saw this plane yesterday, because it just brought back such memories. And I'm embarrassed to say I'm a 75-year-old woman. I should not be so emotional about this, but I was, because we were all flying against the wall. My mother's eardrums busted when she went down the steps, and we were buried 8 hours under the house.
Her mother and 2 brothers survived the bombing of Minsk.
And my mom reached everybody out. She was the last one to be pulled out.
So many of Calkins' neighbors and friends did not.
On the 27th of February, they killed over 1,200 people.
And so you can understand why Calkins
The wingspan, the noise.
is ready for this flying piece of America's war history
But this time it's not dropping the bomb.
to leave town, never to fly over her home again.
I didn't realize how this affected me after all those years.
In Muskegon, John Mills, WZZM 13 News.
Good evening. I'm Louisa Calkins, and I'm from the city of Mainz, which is an ancient city. It's now 2,052 years old. And it was built by the Romans, and when the Romans were conquered by the French, they settled there for quite some time. Napoleon loved it so well, he conquered it twice. And he even built a love castle on the shores of the Rhine, which is still still standing. There's a hotel now, and my husband and my favorite hotel, that's where we spend time when we go home and visit our relatives. I was born in 1938, and when Mainz was bombed, that was the 27th of February 1945, I was 7 years old, and I lived through it, as you probably heard from this video, which I now have to change my speech a little bit because I was going to start somewhere else. I was born to the business person. My father had a business and my mother had a business. We were little kids on the Rhine. That's my brother and I, when we were looking for flowers around the shores of the Rhine. My mom always took us there. They had a promenade there, like a boardwalk, where we could walk, and there were kiosks where we got sweets, and we just enjoyed seeing the ships go by. And that's why I love Muskegon. I can still see ships going by, and I love the water. My early childhood was quite privileged because of my father's being a businessman, and my mom also had her business. This picture shows my family. My father was superimposed on it. It was only my mother taking a picture with us, a photo with us, because my father was already taken away from us because he made a speech against Hitler. And so they took his whole family. His father was arrested because they were an enemy of the Reich. They were considered enemy of Hitler and what he was standing for. So my two uncles, within 4 weeks of each other, died in Auschwitz, supposedly of pneumonia. They were two healthy young men. My father was missing for a long time. We didn't know where they had taken him until shortly before the war ended, like in 1943, in the fall of 1943, my mom was notified by a farmer that my father had befriended in an internment camp in Stetten am Kalten Markt, that was near the Czech border. And that was the first time my mom had contact with my father. And the farmer said for my mom to bring us children to the camp where my father was situated, to the farmhouse. So my mom boarded a train with 3 of us, and the trains at that time were filled with soldiers going towards the Russian front because the Germans were already on a retreat because they knew they couldn't win the war, but they still sent soldiers to the Russian front. My father ended up in Odessa, and that's where the last card he tried to send to me for my birthday came to this Muskegon here, after 55 years later. And my father, we saw my father, but even on the way to my father, the trains were bombed regularly. And every time the train tried to make it into a tunnel on the way to this situation where my father was. But the one time, my mom, they were all soldiers, they were hanging on the outside of the train even, there was no room. We were the only children and one woman, my mom, on that train. My mom had to go to the bathroom, so she went to when the train stopped again for an air raid, she went to a burned out train to go to the bathroom, where she got stuck because the train started moving forward and we lost my mom. 2 days later, through the help of the soldier, the Red Cross took us in, and my mom caught up 2 days later with us. Eventually, we made it to my father. We saw him in high snow, that's the only thing I can remember. And he kind of hugged us all, and he told me that the next day he knew he was going to be shipped out, and the farmer had arranged it all. We were in some kind of a cow pasture or someplace. I can only remember hay and dark walls, because I was at that time 6 years shortly before my 7th birthday. And I got a big hug from him, and he said, tomorrow morning, when you see a light out of the trains were way below, running by where we were situated, that light through the grate on that train, that's me. The farmer had given him a flashlight, which was a prized possession apparently, and he lit out there and waved to me. And then a young woman held my sled, we were on sleds, and dropped the sled that was hanging over the railroad with the trains below, but they luckily retrieved me. And how we made it home, it was an endless trip back home with air raids and all. But my mom never lost sight. I don't think she went to the bathroom till we got home. But from a very privileged childhood, we had continuous air raids and war from the time I can remember until we were bombed out. So this is my birth house on the left, as you see. That in front of it, my grandma stands, and that big dog was their dog. I was born where this young man stands on the right, and because my mother didn't make it upstairs when I was to be delivered on the 20th of January. And she was in the room next to the butcher store that was owned by my grandpa. And there I was born, and during my birth, they had a revelry, they had carnival time from the 11th of November to the Ash Wednesday, the Mainz People Party. And it's carnival, it's like Mardi Gras continuous. They just love parties, they love all sorts of parties. And one of the horses shied when they were given a little musical tribute to my grandma, whom they liked. And because they always got sausage and food afterwards when they did that. That's why they came in the first place. And a horse shied and went right into that room as I was born. They had to shoot the poor horse because of me being born in there. The midwife wasn't there yet. My father delivered me. So that's how I came into this world. In the street with that tower, that was my street. It's called Löhrstraße. The banks of the Rhine usually emptied over and landed in the street. So when we were children, you could drive right through from one side of the house to the other. And in little boats. We had little boats to go through with there. It was a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun. And I had two brothers, so the two of us, and the two brothers and I had a good time. And the rest of the boys in the street too. This is, on the left-hand side, it's my friend in Worms, where my aunt lived, and that little girl, that's me, age 1. And on the right side is my mom, with my brothers and I, and we used to be dressed to kill because she was born in August. She believed in beautiful clothes, so we had ermine colors, and she wanted to show off her kids. My dad was already gone at that time, so I had a dollhouse with electricity that was specially made, and even little water. And we had my brother had a train station, a whole room full of trains with everything on it, and a plane where you could sit in. And everything a kid could want, we had. But my favorite toy was a cash register that was in a little grocery store that was also made for us. I kept selling stuff which my mother baked and I sold. And the rest I ate. So we always had a good time. And this is on the left-hand side is my father before he died. He weighed 95 pounds at the time. He used to be a heavy-set man, and he was, as you can tell, a very undecorated soldier, unwilling, because he was sent with 4 of his other friends were there too, to the Russian front as an informer. They were supposed to look where the enemy was. They were, in other words, they were cannon fodder. They were not important. On the right-hand side are my 2 uncles, George and Joseph, the ones who died in Auschwitz. And I never met them, can't remember them at all. And on February 27th, 1945, is when Mainz was totally destroyed. 89% of my hometown was totally burned out, bombed out. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the first alert was starting. I was practicing walking with my new stilts that I had gotten for my birthday. And my mom caught up with me in one of the narrow streets. They were all very narrow streets. You could literally shake your hands across to the next house. And when the bombs, before we got home, the bombs already were falling. There was no second or third alarm that day, because no one expected Mainz to be bombed. They all thought Frankfurt was supposed to be bombed according to what we knew. And I was told all these details afterwards, because as a kid you don't know when the bombs were coming. We practically lived in the cellar. My mom had little chairs and a table made for us, and because my father and grandfather were butchers, there was a cooling house in the cellar, and the cellar was on the foundation of a Roman building. The house was a red sandstone house, so when they started bombing us, we practically lived there. We had to wear dark clothing because we were not supposed to be seen by the enemy, and like they were caring who they were bombing. Nobody cared. They just haphazardly bombed everywhere. But the cities were marked, and there was a Colonel Harris, I believe, an Englishman, who wanted Mainz totally burned out, because he started already a firestorm in September before 1945, before the February heavy bombing. We were already losing like 2,000 people in September before that. So it was a very long, drawn-out war. And on the 27th of February, as we arrived at our house with my stilts still in tow, because I wasn't going to give them up, the door fell in right with us into the basement. Then we were buried. And my mom told us afterwards we were buried for 8 hours, before we were dug out. But then all the whole lights were out. My mom was the only one in charge because it were all women and children. So she decided she had to tell them what to do, which she was really good at in the first place. So she told them everybody had to be quiet. We children had to call out our names where we were situated because she didn't quite know, because the air mines had such pressure when we flew down the stairs and the door came following us. And then the debris, no one knew who was where. The other women and children were already in the basement, except for one old lady who didn't make it. But after they took us out, which seemed to be days, endless, we were walking through an inferno that I can only describe as total hell, because that's what I imagined hell would look like even as a grown-up, because there were dead bodies everywhere, horses, dogs, people on fire. The lady, our favorite lady who used to sell us movie tickets, we passed by, and the fire illuminated all this gruesome scene. And we tried to make our way to the Rhine River, which was totally in flames because the ships that were the barges that were going up and down the Rhine, carrying coal and other things that were burnable, were all on fire. So everything was an inferno. We wore gas masks, house shoes, and clothing that was dark. My brother Ado was sick at the time. We carried in a duvet cover. My mother had put a duvet cover, had him put in a duvet cover, and my brother Klaus and I carried on each corner, helped her carry him. And that's how we made it out of the city. We walked and walked and walked, and it was, in the meantime, the bombs were still falling. They hadn't stopped yet, because we walked into the countryside where no one wanted to see city people, because we invaded their homes, so to speak. No one let us in. My mother knocked on doors, just like Mary and Joseph with little Jesus, and there was no one to let us in. And when we got to a city called Nackenheim, we went into a schoolyard where other people who had fled the cities were already located, and we stayed in the schoolyard. It was very cold and damp. It was a day like today, this windy and cold. And we stayed there, and the next day the mayor of the city of Nackenheim opened the doors of the gym of that schoolyard, and we could all go in the gym. So we were housed in the gym, and after a few days, the Caritas came and the Red Cross came, and they set up soup kitchens, but we didn't have a pot. So we couldn't even get soup at the time. And then when the mayor ordered the people to take the refugees in, we ended up in an old lady's attic, where we slept 4 across, a box spring, and old rubble that she had up there. We could smell her fried bacon in the morning with eggs or whatever good she had, but she wouldn't give us anything. So my mom literally knocked on doors. We had nothing. We had the clothes on our back and the gas masks and our house shoes. So finally, she befriended a lady who was supposed to give up milk. We had become what you call here displaced persons, so we got a special pass as a displaced person, and for that we were eligible to get milk and had cards to have like ration cards. And when we had the ration cards, you got like 50 grams of butter, a little piece of bread, or you have to really share. You were hungry no matter what you had. There wasn't enough food to go around. And would never know now, but it really was hard. And after the lady befriended my mom from the milk store, my mom told us that she could do her hair, and she would work for food. And the lady gave us a can until we got milk, and she let my mom do her hair, and then they became friends. My mom told her what was going on, And she said, you know, my daughter is getting married. You can do her and the wedding parties here. And she's supposed to move into a home that's like a villa. And because you don't have a home, I want you to live there. She can stay home with us. So we got to go in a villa where we had to be real quiet and nice so that nobody would throw us out. And we lived there for a while. And when the first chance presented itself, we walked back to Mainz, to our hometown. And on the way there, they had patrols with Americans. And first we had, the Americans were on our side of the Rhine, but then they switched with the French, and our region became under French occupation. And on the side of the right side of the Rhine, that was under American occupation. But while we were still under American occupation, my aunt was with us too with a baby. Her husband was in prison in Russia, and she walked with us, and unfortunately she was accosted and molested. And we heard her scream and came out with stripped clothes after one soldier put a gun on my mother and the other one led her in a shed. After that, we didn't walk to Mainz anymore. We stayed in Nackenheim for a long time. And then when we finally got back, when we thought things were safe after French occupation, my mom felt better because she was of French origin. So when we went to Mainz, she got a job with the French people in their commissary. What her job was to kill rats, to keep the food safe. But she did, but she couldn't take any food out. Then when General Koenig was there, he let my mom do his wife's hair, because she told the French people that she was a hairdresser. And so pretty soon she did all the majors' and generals' wives' hair. And she took us with her, got this old raggedy bicycle, and we walked behind or ran behind as fast as we could, and trying to get a piece of bread here and there, which sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But we struggled for many years because she had to squat like we were homeless. So one of her friends said, well, there's this house that's burned out. You can squat in the ruins. It was third floor walk-up, but it wasn't really a walk-up because the stairway was burned out. And it looked very similar to this. And we walked up on the third floor. You could only walk one person at a time. And the whole thing was swinging. So when you got upstairs, we took all this kind of debris we threw out from the third floor down. And then we took bricks and cleaned the bricks, other bricks with a brick to make them smooth. And my mom built a wall, so we had to try to get them back up, which was another story. It was not too good. We had a piece of tar paper. That's how we start out. No food, no home, no electricity. We had to get water in a barracks that was about a block or so away. And my brother Ado, who was then healthier, was supposed to carry, we found a horse pail. They had these tall pails with a handle underneath it, and we were supposed to carry it together. And Ado, he's always fresh, he didn't really want to help, he's a year younger than I was, and he decided to jump ahead of me and promptly fell through a hole in a cellar where he disappeared. So the fire department had to come to get him out, and he had cut his tendons on his leg. And so we had to take him to the hospital. After 9 surgeries, he still walked, but he always limped a little bit. And he never had to do another thing. He went through life he was privileged after that. It was all my brother Klaus and I who had to collect twigs, so we had fire. We had no coals. The French occupation took the coals and they shipped them out from Mainz, through Mainz, in wagons. And the desperate Mainz people jumped the train. My brother Klaus and I were one of those desperate people one night. And then they would shoot. When they would see someone, the French would shoot at them. Well, because the Klaus, we had to be quiet, real quiet, and they were grown-ups with us from the neighborhood. My brother's fingers got caught in the door when they slammed it after we jumped in there. So after that, he didn't collect any more coals, but we had to find twigs to make firewood out of. So we had warmth, and we did that, but it was hard. It was a continuous struggle, and my mom worked for food only, and she also traded things, whatever she could find. And when our basement, our cellars, they were still intact after they excavated everything, but we couldn't rebuild because we had no money. They found a chest that she had placed in the cooling unit from my grandpa with silver in it. Well, it was supposed to be fireproof, but it wasn't quite fireproof. It kind of melted together in the lump on the outside, but the sterling silver in the middle was still pretty good. So she took piece by piece and went to the farmers and traded for bread. And we went with her, and then we were discovering that you could work in the fields with the farmers when they had the potato harvest. We could walk after the plow and pick up potatoes with all the rest of the people that were out there. So we did that, and all day long, and as long as we could crawl, we did it. And at the end, when it was dark, the farmer said, so whatever is left in the field, if you can find something, you can have it. So sometimes we found 3 little potatoes for a day's work. It was a hard time, but 3 little potatoes meant another day of food. When we had nothing for several days, my mom told us to sing. We would stand upstairs in the room, and we look up on the shiniest star that was on heaven, that was supposedly be our father. She said, sing, that's your father, he's going to give you bread tomorrow. So we sang a lot. Not good, but loud and clear. So that's how our life went after the war. And it wasn't easy. These were living quarters of people that most of the people lived in cellars, ruins, whatever was available. They made living quarters out of it. You can tell by the way it's put together. Wasn't too skilled. The wall my mother erected in the ruin that we were in was crooked, and she would never let anyone take down. Almost till she died, she lived in that apartment. After it was covered with tar paper, we had a friend, Ernst Nege, who was also a roofer, and he also was a singer. He made a song about mines, which is a thing in my books that I laid on the table out there where you can see him. And how, if he was God, how he would heal the wounded mines and its people. But the people of mines never left their resiliency, because we always look forward to tomorrow. And we still try and do this until this day. And that's about how it went. And after this were the ration cards where you see it for clothing, for hygiene products, and everyone had to have passes. I see my friend Inge nodding in agreement. We all lived from hand to mouth. There wasn't much we had. Everyone suffered together, and everyone tried to make it through. And some of us were fortunate enough to do that. And we still try to be resilient to this day. These were the bombs that were dropped on us. And some of the things that were mentioned already tonight by the professor, I agree with, but then there were other things. Mines was distinctly marked. They marked it with colors, and what they called Christmas trees, they would, before they dropped the bombs, we would see like Christmas trees coming down on parachutes into our cities. If the sky was clear, we could see them in advance. As kids, we thought it was wonderful to see parachutes coming down, but then when they lit up like Christmas trees, this when the bombs, the fire bombs, would fall and set things on fire. And the reason why so many people died in many of our cities, we had wood and tar covered wood streets. And these people in Mainz, for instance, but if we would have gone down the wrong street that night, we would have burned to death because we would have glued to the tar over the wood that was all on fire after the bombs were dropped. So it was very hard. And the worst part was getting through that night. And when I talk about it, it's like the nightmares are still there, and I didn't know none of us kids had help. We should have all had help, being talked to by anyone. No one talked about it. We were not allowed to complain, or we were not allowed to talk about it. And in schools, I went from first grade into third grade, because when we were out in the country, we kind of missed it. And when we got to school, we all were given Lebedran. I don't know the English word for this. It was like, it was derived from fish oil. That was what we got. We had to take that. Cod liver oil, that's the word I was looking for. 1 spoon fed the whole class. I was lucky, it was a third in the alphabet. So this rusty spoon, and every time I had a chance, I was taught on the third floor. I tried to make it for the windows, I wouldn't have to swallow it. But then I got picked out for being undernourished because I was just too skinny. They picked me out in school. And I had to go to a home for kids that were undernourished, which was more tragic than being bombed, I have to say that, because I ran away from there because I didn't like it. I was going to be with my family, with my mom. I was so afraid that I would lose everybody that I couldn't take that. So after I ran away, I was back home. My mom was the same day was going to visit me, and it was a long way home. But we made it. And I'm supposed to talk about my adult life now, and I don't have the clicker, Cassie. Yeah. Oh, this is how I met David. David was a policeman at Lee Barracks, and I worked in the U.S. Army Dental Clinic at the same barracks, and he had a Porsche Speedster. That's why he wanted that picture in there for the young people to see. And this was us when we got married 52 years ago on the 19th of February. And after that, we had our first child in Mainz. She was born in Wiesbaden at the Air Force Hospital, our daughter Corinna. And we just had a great time with our children because our son Karim was born here in Muskegon, Michigan. We came here and lived happily ever after with a couple of detours to Hastings and Tecumseh to live. And we came full circle back to Muskegon, and we love it here. Our children are gainfully employed. We have 2 good citizens. One is a science teacher who teaches the gifted and talented, was also Teacher of the Year, our son Karim and our daughter Corinna, who lives in Elsie, where the cows say good night to each other, near Lansing. Both are college graduates from Michigan State, too, and master's degrees, and they are very good in what they're doing. They have a wonderful family, and we're all happy to be here. And I'm going to move back to Harbortown. That's why I'm in the middle of a move right now as I speak, and from Lakeshore Drive. And I hope everyone wasn't bored to tears tonight, but that's my speech. Thank you very much.
I want to give you just a little bit of a different perspective than Louisa, because I'm obviously not of that generation, but I'm the daughter of that generation. And so I want to tell you a little bit about my mother and the clicker. May I have that? Oh, wonderful. All right. What I think I'll do is, last year I was able to come and talk a little bit about my mother's life. This is my mother, Margot. She was born in 1924, and so when the war began, she was about 15 or so, and she distinctly remembers coming home, and it had been announced on the radio that the war had started. They didn't know what they were in for, and neither did any of the rest of us. She lived right there in Heidelberg, Mannheim, that area, and she was involved in getting an education, and she went to the Vorbeck-Schule. That was a school for translators, and she traveled by the WWII. That was a little train that went back and forth between Heidelberg and Mannheim for about 2 years. She continued her education. She learned French and she learned English. She really preferred French, a little Spanish, and she lived as much of a life as a teenager as possible. But in the year 1941, she and her mother moved to Mannheim. That wasn't very far from Heidelberg, and Mannheim was a beautiful city. It was had a historical Baroque palace. The Count of the Palatinate had lived there. He was a really powerful man in medieval times, and they had an apartment there. But unfortunately, Mannheim was also an industrial center. And that was where these first terror bombings that Mr. Maniatis was telling you about, that's the first terror bombings that happened. They tried bombing. It was all relatively new, bombing not only the industrial center, which was outside of the city, but also bombing the civilians. They built bunkers for the population, and Mother remembers that her bunker was on the tennis court, and when the sirens went off, then you ran to the bunkers, and it was all pretty new, and so everyone rushed there to be protected. The bombing raids, there were, I think, I've seen if I look here on my notes, I think I have here, the bombs were from December 1940 to March 1945. There were over the industrial center of the city was destroyed, but also the whole city center was completely razed in Mannheim. And there was obviously no industry whatsoever there. Mother survived and graduated in the springtime of 1942. She sat for her exams and became a certified translator. She was 18 years old, and this was the time, of course, when everybody was working for their country, and so she got a job. The job was with the Auswärtige Amt, the Foreign Service. They had listening posts where they listened to the French and the English broadcast, and they recorded it and they translated it, and Mother was not an analyzer. She just recorded it because she wasn't that skilled yet, and they were listening, and this job happened to be in Berlin. So that meant she needed to move from Mannheim, where she was, up to the capital, to Berlin. A friend of hers, Irmgard, had already had a job there, and so she was the one, you know someone, and that's how you get your job, and that's exactly how it happened with my mom as well. So she moves to Berlin, and the daily life in Berlin is a bit different than in Mannheim. Things are getting worse for the German civilians as the war progresses. Your daily ration of food was a bowl of soup, potato usually, and a hard roll and some jelly. That's what you got to eat. There was this thing called substitute coffee. It was called Muckenkaffee, which means insect coffee, but it really wasn't ground up insects. It was roasted carrots that were then ground up. But can you imagine coffee that's made out of roasted carrots? Well, probably not. There was no time really to go shopping, although Mother was in the capital of Germany. It was, there was no time, but there was really nothing to shop for anyway. Used clothes were remade by seamstresses, and there was no fashion consciousness whatsoever. Very few men, obviously, but the public transportation functioned, and the city of Berlin continued to function, and people went to work, except my mother said the fear and dread of the night was something that was getting progressively worse. And this was, of course, again, an attack on the civilian population in Berlin. From November 1943 until March of 44, there were concerted efforts to break the will of the German people by bombing Berlin. Over 314 sorties. This was this Battle of Berlin. Had more bomb attacks in Berlin than in Mannheim, obviously. Here came the bombers and the sirens, and in the middle of the night, they bombed. At 11 o'clock in the morning, they bombed. Those were the two waves, and Mom said you could always count on there being bombs at 11 and bombs in the middle of the night to get you out of bed. I included there those numbers from the Hamburg firebombing, and of course the most famous fire bombings were those in Dresden, where more than 135,000 people lost their lives. And Kurt Vonnegut wrote about it in Slaughterhouse 5. So the civilian bombing was just horrific, and we heard from Louisa that just the terror of this bombing on the civilian populations. Well, Mother also had to contend with that in Berlin. They set up bunkers, as you have probably seen the ones in London. This was one in Berlin, and they built them near the apartment houses, and right there was one. I don't have a pointer, I'm sorry. Right there is an entrance to one of the bunkers that you can still see in Berlin. My mom lived and worked kind of near the zoo. There was a bunker built at the zoo. And she tells the story of one time as the sirens go off, she and her mom rushing to the entrance just as the doors close in her face. And so they couldn't get in. The sirens are wailing, the bombs are starting to fall, and so they rushed over and stood underneath railroad tracks in an attempt to have some kind of protection from the bombs. Luckily, she didn't need that. The Battle of Berlin was not successful, as Mr. Maniatis mentioned. That will of the population wasn't broken, but there were 850,000 people that were left homeless. Now, Berlin, of course, becomes the focus for the Eastern Front and the Russians moving in toward Berlin. The Germans were very fearful of the Russians, and maybe justly so. As the Russians came, they ended up taking Berlin, and the fighting was house to house and door to door. It left Berlin a pile of rubble. The estimates at the end were 39 cubic yards of rubble for each Berliner. But luckily, my mother was already gone before the Russians arrived. In fact, the listening post was ordered to leave Berlin because they hadn't really given up, they hadn't admitted defeat, and so they wanted this listening post to move from Berlin back down to the Black Forest, to the Dobel Mountain, it was called. It was a beautiful area, and they were going to set up there and continue listening. The only problem was that you had to get there on your own. And so my mother ended up with her mother going here to the train station. This was one of the train stations in Berlin, the Anhalter Bahnhof. And as you can see, it had already been hit numerous times. Obviously, transportation was something, a legitimate target and had been heavily bombed. So she and my grandmother waited there to get on a train going south. And of course, you had to wait for the break in the bombing. As Louisa was talking, the trains would try to find a tunnel somewhere when the bombs started raining down upon them. So in order to leave the train station, you had to have a bit of luck. You had to be standing right at the track at the right time because it was a mad push onto the train. So it took my mother and my grandmother 5 days to get onto the train. And then they stood sort of shoulder to shoulder as they traveled south out of Berlin. Mom remembers that she had a little suitcase with her, and they packed it with food, pudding. All right? And I'm assuming a spoon, but pudding. All right? You pack things that you think are going to be important and essential for yourself, and so they had pudding. They also wore sort of their best coats and things that they thought would be useful as well. My grandmother had been working in East Prussia and had walked out in front of the Russian army carrying a portable typewriter, because my grandmother thought that would be something useful when the war is over. I'll be able to type letters for people. Now, that's another story for another time. So anyway, so on they do make it down here to the Dobel Mountain. My mother reports for duty, but that southern area of Germany is now under attack by the French. And the French are coming. In fact, they're shelling. So the listening post decides that they will abandon the listening post and flee to the woods where they're going to try and hide. But the artillery begins to find them, and at that point, the people in control of the post decide they're going to surrender. So with a white flag, my mother and Ingeborg, or Tante Irmgard, I looked at Inge. Tante Irmgard, they get rounded up because they had worked at the listening post. And so they were considered dangerous. So all of the men in the village, plus my mother and Tante Irmgard, get put into the church where they're locked in, and for the next 3 days, they're there without any food, some water, but they were locked in, which is what saved my mother from being raped, because the Moroccan French troops were turned loose in the village and, as they say, had their way. So my mother was very lucky, although for several days she was scared to death. The troops moved on, the French troops moved on. That territory was now under the control of the Allies, and my mom had a choice. She could work for the farmers, or she could clean and work in a hotel, because the French officers had set up their command post in a very lovely hotel. That this is an area where you go and before the war, you go and take the waters there, and you have a relaxing vacation. And so that's the kind of hotel where they were like. So mother thought, hotel, without a doubt. Because what she would get paid was not in money, but in food. And so if she worked at the hotel, then all the leftovers would come to her. And that's what she figured would be the better deal. So she did. She worked there for a while. But her mother and her friends were in Heidelberg. And now these are the occupation zones after the Allied forces had divided up Germany. And right there where that little star is, that's the French area. And right on the border is the border with the American area was Heidelberg. And that was where my mother was headed. Mainz is just a little bit to the north of that star, and right in the French zone. Irmgard wanted to go to Heilbronn to her family, and my mom wanted to get back to Heidelberg, so they talked they smiled and they talked the vegetable man into giving them a ride down the mountain. Now, while she'd been working at the hotel, she had made herself as ugly as possible, she tells me. She wore old clothes and made sure her face was really dirty and kind of walked with a stoop, because you didn't want to attract anyone's attention. And she managed to, I guess, stand up and smile at this truck driver. And down the mountain they went. And she and Irmgard had to walk then down the German Autobahn. Now, you know the Autobahns, the precursors of our superhighways. Well, here she is. They walked down the Autobahns. It was about 30 miles or so to Heidelberg, so they had to spend the night in a farmer's haystack. They had a little wagon that they were pulling a few things with them. That belonged to Irmgard, though, and she took it when she got to Heilbronn. And American soldiers were coming down this Autobahn in their jeeps and in their trucks, but there was no fraternization. In other words, the soldiers were not supposed to talk to the civilians at all. And so they would say hi to the Fräuleins, but then they couldn't stop or give them a ride. They had to just keep going. So my mom walked on and got to Heidelberg. Heidelberg was saved bombing. It was never bombed during the war, and there's lots of different stories why. Supposedly, an American that was in charge of the plotting the bombing had studied at the university in Heidelberg, and that was one of the reasons. There was nothing of industrial worth here in Heidelberg. It was a small town, a university, but then Mainz didn't have much worth bombing either. But Heidelberg was saved from bombing. And the Americans, seeing a beautiful place, said, oh, this is where we'll set up our headquarters. So the 7th Army was headquartered in Heidelberg, and the 12th Armored Division was part of that group. This is going to become important in a minute. All right. This is what Heidelberg looked like at that time. These are pictures that my mom took, and you can see the bridge and a castle. The castle was bombed out by the French, not by the French in an earlier generation. Was the French too. It was Napoleon that had bombed that earlier on. So here was Heidelberg. My mother got to Heidelberg and needed a job. Now, she did have skills, remember? She spoke English, she spoke French, and so she decided that maybe she could get a job with the Americans. The 7th Army had set up a special services office in Heidelberg, and that special services office was there to negotiate with businesses and to get the German manufacturers to produce commercial items. The war is over, and we need to get German industry going again, and they need translators. Ha, right? Okay. There were lots of people that said, oh, I can translate. And so to get an appointment, to get an interview with the Americans was really difficult. But my mother was lucky, and one August day, as she was walking over the bridge, she ran into a friend back from that translator school, from the Vorbeckschule, and this young woman said, oh, I have an appointment, but I'm so scared of those Americans. You know, they're just, you don't know if they're vicious or what. I don't think I can do this. And my mom said, I'll take your spot. Give me that little card. I'll go for the interview. And so she did. She went here to Bismarckplatz, and that's one of the main squares in town still today. And there she went to the Americans, and she took a test, and then she had an interview, and then they offered her a job. And so she thought, this is going to be wonderful. And then they introduced her to her boss. And he was a colonel from Texas. Y'all, you know how they talk in Texas? And here's a German trying to understand this. Plus, he also smokes a cigarette, and so she has to deal with all of that as well. She said she was really happy that this colonel had a private that, a private, a GI, that helped him out in the office. And so that was my mother's translator of the colonel's directions. And I think she probably, we can understand, she probably needed that. Mom was able to go out and translate with the businesses and help that way. She was taken around the office, and here she is in her one suit, because she only had one. She wore it every day, but she smiled and worked for the Americans. She became taken around the office by the colonel because, well, you can tell she's pretty attractive, right? And he wanted to show her off a little bit. And as she was going around, there was this Captain McAfoose, or Mac, as they called him. And oh, the sparks flew. And as you probably can guess, this is my father. So by this point in time, you could fraternize with the enemy, and they went for a walk. My mother borrowed gloves, white gloves, and borrowed nylons from another friend, and they strolled over the bridge and along the Neckar. First date, right? Well, maybe not first date, first encounter. And then Mac borrowed a Jeep, and they drove up to Dillsburg, a ruin. If you can see in the upper left-hand corner, it sits up on the top of a mountain. It's on the Neckar River, very romantic. The pictures are from that time period, so the quality. On the lower left, there's my mom and my dad standing there in the tower in Dillsburg. Very, very romantic encounter. I want to tell you here a little bit about the story of the ocelot coat. And I have here a little piece of that ocelot coat. My pillow of the ocelot coat. Some of the lieutenants in the office got some Jeeps, I guess it was a VW, and said, oh, let's go to Berlin and see what's happened in Berlin. And so my mom thought, oh, that would be great, because her dad, Heinrich Weil, had been in Berlin. She didn't really know if he had survived and how he was doing. So this was an opportunity. She thought, oh, I'll take this chance and I'll go with him. And the lieutenant said, oh, sure, come along, we'll have a great time. You can sit in the back, we don't have a heater, so you need to wear your ocelot coat, all right? You need to dress warmly. So she does, and it's December 1945, and they thought, well, maybe we should check and see if you need a visa or something to go in between occupation zones, but nobody really knew. So they thought, young people, they thought, oh, what the heck, let's just go, right? Now, at the same time that this was happening, Captain McAfoose was taking about 30 tanks to Berlin because tension is building between the Soviets and the British, French, and American forces. And so the British, French, and Americans want to have some tanks in Berlin. But that's another story, too, how he gets these 30 tanks to Berlin. They're both going to Berlin, but they don't meet in Berlin. That's not the story. My mom, in the back of the VW, drives to the little star. You can see we have to go through that red occupied zone, through the Soviet zone, to get to Berlin. On the way, they're having a good time. It's great. They leave the American zone. They go through Helmstadt. They enter the Russian zone. wonderful. Oh, they pose for pictures here with the Russian guards. It's going to be great. They get to Berlin. Margot meets her dad. He has a tobacco store, which was really the only money at this point in time, was cigarettes. And so he's doing okay. He's survived the war. Everything's great. They spend about 4 or 5 days in Berlin, and then they look at the damage. Berlin is a mess, but they're cleaning it up. The Brandenburg Gate, the icon here of Berlin, has been battered, but it's not down. And then they're ready to go back. That's when we had a little problem. Because Margot had been born in Berlin, and now the Russians are going, well, you can't cross back into the American zone. You got to stay in the Russian zone. And the lieutenants are going, oh my gosh, the captain will kill us, and so will the colonel. All right, we got to get this woman back. So, as you can see, the bribe ended up being 3 cartons of cigarettes and 5 K-rations to get my mother back to the American zone. They drove to a less well-manned crossing. They kind of went along the track and bouncing along. And the Russian guard, by the way, he thought he'd go with them with his loaded gun, until they found someone that would let my mother escape to the American zone. So, whew, thank goodness, right? And my mom and dad would eventually get married. One of the about 20,000 German war brides by 1949. That was about the right timing. My dad couldn't get he had volunteered to stay behind and help with this rebuilding the German industry, but then he had to leave in the springtime. And so he was shipped back to the States. My mom and he wrote back and forth, and they eventually then he proposed in a letter, and she flew here to the States to marry him in 1948. I have to leave you with one more story, and you'll appreciate this. She was looking at the map of the United States. Now, my dad came from a little town in southern Illinois called Benton, and it has about 7,000 people in it. But Mom didn't know that, and so she looked at this map of the United States, and she thought, oh, look, Benton, right on the edge of this wonderful Lake Michigan. Of course, she was looking at Benton Harbor, all right? And when she got to Benton, Illinois, all it was cornfields. And her husband, so that was good. So thank you very much for your attention, and I appreciate being able to share a little bit with you.
Well, that's it for tonight, folks. We look forward to having you next week when Frank Marzak and the staff of the Silversides will be having a special lecture for you. And we also have a secret surprise next week. Secret surprise. A secret surprise. So please come prepared to be engaged next week. This has the markings of being a very fine lecture. So see you next week.